We are going to win.
Got to keep the white and the black separate.
The 1970s were a time of big changes in politics and a lot of fun, so it's okay if you don't remember everything that happened back then.
We must never allow America to become the second strongest nation in the world.
Now, many years later, some of these stories might be new to you. As the 1970s ended, the world saw the first person walk on the moon, which was a huge moment.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
But after that, things got a bit tough. There was a big scandal in American politics. These events are what people remember most about the 1970s, making it a decade that is still talked about today. Join us as we explore the 13 important events from the 1970s you probably forgot.
January 22nd, 1973 will stand out as one of the great days for freedom and free choice.
In 1973, a crucial event took place that changed the course of history: the end of the Vietnam War. The conflict had been a long and arduous struggle involving the United States and its allies against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The turning point came with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, a momentous agreement that officially concluded U.S. involvement in the war.
That the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors.
The Paris Peace Accords were a series of negotiations held in the French capital, involving representatives from the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. After months of talks, the parties reached a consensus, leading to the signing of the Accords on January 27, 1973. The agreement aimed to bring an end to the conflict, establish a ceasefire, and pave the way for a political resolution. One of the key provisions of the Accords was the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Vietnam.
Permit the movement of refugees to the area of their choice.
This marked a significant moment in American military history, as it signaled the conclusion of a highly controversial and divisive war. The U.S. had been involved in Vietnam for over a decade, and the war had sparked widespread protests and social unrest at home. The end of the Vietnam War had a big impact on American society. People back home had been protesting against the war for a long time, and now they could celebrate that it was over. However, the war also caused a lot of pain and sadness, and it took time for the country to heal.
Demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest.
As the Vietnam War concluded in 1973, a nation celebrated, but what unfolds next? Little do we know, the shadows of the Watergate scandal are about to cast a dark cloud over America's political landscape. The Watergate scandal was a big problem in the United States in the 1970s. It was about President Richard Nixon and his people trying to hide their involvement in a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972. This break-in happened at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. When the people who did the break-in were caught, the press and the Department of Justice found money on them that was connected to President Nixon's re-election committee. More investigations and trials showed that Nixon approved plans to hide his administration's part in the break-in, and there were secret recordings in the Oval Office.
That we will be as strong as we need to be for as long as we need to be.
The House of Representatives and the Senate started investigations. Witnesses said Nixon tried to cover up what happened, and there was a voice-activated recording system in the Oval Office. Nixon's administration didn't cooperate, causing a big problem for the country. In 1973, the House began a process to remove Nixon from office, and the Supreme Court said he had to give investigators the tapes from the Oval Office. The tapes revealed that Nixon had tried to hide things after the break-in and used government officials to distract from the investigation. The House approved 3 charges against Nixon: obstructing justice, abusing power, and disrespecting Congress. People stopped supporting Nixon, and it was certain he would be removed from office. So on August 9, 1974, he became the only U.S. president to resign.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
His successor, Gerald Ford, pardoned him on September 8, 1974. In total, 69 people were accused and 48 were convicted, including top officials from Nixon's administration. The term Watergate became a way to talk about the illegal things Nixon's people did, like spying on opponents and using government agencies for political reasons. The scandal also made the suffix "gate" a common way to talk about scandals in general, especially in politics.
whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've done.
Apollo 13 was a space mission that happened from April 11th to 17, 1970. It was the 7th time people went into space as part of the Apollo program, and they were supposed to be the third group to land on the moon. The mission had 3 astronauts. Jim Lovell was in charge, Jack Swigert was the command module pilot, and Fred Hayes was the lunar module pilot. However, 2 days into the mission, there was a big problem. An oxygen tank in the part of the spacecraft called the service module got damaged, and it caused serious issues with the spacecraft's power and life support systems. So the plan to land on the moon had to be canceled.
Okay, you're go to start powering up the command module. Right, we're starting now.
To make things worse, the crew had to move to another part of the spacecraft called the lunar module, which was only designed for 2 people and for a shorter time. The astronauts faced a lot of difficulties like limited power, a cold and wet space inside the spacecraft, and not enough drinkable water. Despite these challenges, they had to figure out how to survive and make it back to Earth safely.
We had a dead service module. We had a command module that had no power to it.
The whole situation brought a lot of attention to the mission, and many people watched on TV as the astronauts safely splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean. After investigating what went wrong, they found issues with how they tested the oxygen tank before the mission. They suggested some changes for future missions, like being careful with what goes into the oxygen tank. The story of Apollo 13 has been told in movies and TV shows, with the most famous being the 1995 film Apollo 13. As Apollo 13 faced a life-threatening crisis, one wonders how subsequent Apollo missions overcame challenges and achieved success. Did the moon landings that followed continue to inspire awe and discovery? The Apollo program, spanning from 1969 to 1972, marked a historic era by achieving 6 successful moon landings. These missions showcased a remarkable period of technological progress and human exploration. To delve deeper into the significance of each mission and the dedication of the astronauts involved, let's examine them individually. Apollo 14, landing at the Fra Mauro Formation, was the 3rd successful lunar landing mission. Manned by Alan Shepard Jr., Stuart Roosa, and Edgar Mitchell, the crew launched on January 31, 1971, completing 2 lunar spacewalks and collecting nearly 100 pounds of moon rocks during their 9-day mission. Moving forward, Apollo 15 touched down in the Hadley Apennine region in July 1971 with astronauts David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin. This 4th successful lunar landing mission featured extensive exploration, with Irwin gathering valuable data on the lunar surface while orbiting in the spacecraft.
Scott and Irwin spent 3 days exploring the Apennine-Hadley region in the lunar rover.
Apollo 16, launched on April 16, 1972, achieved the first landing on the lunar highlands. Astronauts John Young and Charles Duke explored the Descartes Highlands, covering nearly 17 miles with the lunar rover. Thomas Mattingly remained in lunar orbit during this mission.
Moving back, the Saturn V lifting off the bow, Alpha pad building up front.
Closing the Apollo mission, Apollo 17 landed on Taurus Littrow in December 1972. The crew, consisting of Eugene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt, marked the final human presence on the moon. Cernan and Schmitt became the last 2 individuals to walk on the lunar surface, concluding a series of successful moon missions that not only expanded scientific knowledge, but also fueled national pride in the space race. Roe v. Wade, a significant decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1973, established that the U.S. Constitution generally protects the right to have an abortion. This ruling overturned many existing abortion laws, sparking an ongoing national debate about the legality of abortion, who should decide it, and the role of moral and religious beliefs in politics. The decision also influenced discussions on the methods the Supreme Court should use in interpreting the Constitution.
Restrictions that exist on a woman's right to control her own reproductive processes.
The case originated with Norma McCorvey using the alias Jane Roe, who sought an abortion in Texas, where it was illegal except to save the mother's life. McCorvey's lawyers filed a lawsuit against the local district attorney Henry Wade, arguing that Texas's abortion laws were unconstitutional. The case went to the Supreme Court, which, in a 7-2 decision, ruled in McCorvey's favor. The court stated that the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause protects a woman's right to privacy, including the right to an abortion.
The state may take legal action to protect the unborn child, even forbidding abortion, except to protect the mother.
However, it acknowledged that this right is not absolute and must be balanced against the government's interests in protecting women's health and prenatal life. The decision established a trimester timetable for regulating abortion and classified the right to abortion as fundamental, subjecting abortion laws to strict scrutiny.
The White House offered no comment, but President Nixon has always strongly opposed liberalized abortion.
Roe's decision was highly controversial, drawing criticism and sparking debates that shaped the political landscape for years. Despite challenges and criticism, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the central holding in the 1992 Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision. This landmark Supreme Court decision legalized abortion nationwide, marking a crucial moment in the women's rights movement and shaping American social policy. In 1973, the world faced a significant energy crisis that had far-reaching consequences. The crisis was triggered by the Arab members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, who imposed an oil embargo on several countries, including the United States, in response to their support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This embargo led to a sudden and severe reduction in oil supply, causing fuel shortages and skyrocketing prices.
They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territory.
As a result, long lines formed at gas stations as people waited for hours to fill up their tanks. The shortage had a profound impact on daily life, affecting transportation, industry, and heating. Governments and businesses were forced to implement measures to conserve energy, and alternative energy sources began to gain attention.
The United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need.
Moreover, in 1979, the world experienced another major energy crisis, exacerbating the challenges faced in 1973. This time, the trigger was the Iranian Revolution, which disrupted oil production and exports from Iran, a significant oil-producing country. The impact of the Iranian hostage crisis compounded the subsequent oil price increases. The consequences were similar to those in 1973, with fuel shortages, long lines at gas stations, and economic disruptions. The crisis highlighted the vulnerability of the global energy supply chain and the need for more resilient and diversified energy sources. The Kent State shootings took place on May 4, 1970 at Kent State University. It was a tragic incident in which 4 unarmed college students lost their lives, and 9 others were wounded by the Ohio National Guard. The shooting took place during a rally opposing the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia by the U.S. military and protesting the National Guard's presence on the campus.
Will you ask them to leave? They've got grievances, they've got demands. The demands on both sides. We have to talk.
During the incident, 28 National Guard soldiers fired about 67 rounds in a span of 13 seconds. This resulted in the deaths of students Allison Krause, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, and Sandra Lee Schuer on the scene, while William Knox Schroeder died shortly afterward at a nearby hospital. One of the wounded students suffered permanent paralysis. Krause and Miller were part of a group of over 300 students protesting the Cambodian campaign announced by President Richard Nixon. Scheuer and Schroeder were among several hundred observers who were more than 300 feet away from the firing line, watching the protest during a break between classes. The shootings ignited immediate outrage across campuses nationwide, leading to an increased participation in the student strike that had begun on May 1st. Ultimately, over 4 million students took part in organized walkouts at numerous universities, colleges, and high schools. As the echoes of the tragic Kent State shootings fade away, one can't help but wonder, how did such events shape the growing environmental consciousness of the 1970s? Let's find out in the next exploration, the pivotal connection between the Kent State tragedy and the birth of the environmental movement. Before the 1970s, Americans were using a lot of leaded gas in big and inefficient cars. Industries were releasing a lot of smoke and waste without worrying much about the law or bad publicity. People thought air pollution was just a sign of progress. Most Americans didn't really care about environmental issues or how a polluted environment could harm human health. Then, on April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day happened. It's an annual event held to show support for protecting the environment.
I want to be able to swim at a beach, and I want to be able to come outside and breathe fresh air.
The idea for Earth Day started in 1969 when peace activist John McConnell proposed a day to honor the Earth and peace. The first Earth Day was supposed to be on March 21, 1970, the first day of spring in the Northern Hemisphere. It was later approved by the United Nations and moved to April 22nd. U.S. Senator Gaylord Nelson then suggested a nationwide environmental teach-in for that day and hired Dennis Hayes to organize it. With the help of partners like the United Auto Workers, the first Earth Day became the largest single-day protest in history, with over 20 million people participating.
Yet the gravity of the message of Earth Day still came through. Act or die.
In 1990, Dennis Hayes took part in Earth Day International, organizing events in 141 countries. On Earth Day 2016, the Paris Agreement, a significant climate protection treaty, was signed. Another similar event, World Environment Day, is organized by the United Nations on June 5th each year, and the first Earth Day marked the beginning of increased awareness and activism for environmental issues. The Pentagon Papers, officially known as The History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam, 1945 and 1968, is a report by the United States Department of Defense about the country's political and military role in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. Daniel Ellsberg, who worked on the study, released the papers to the public in 1971, and they were first revealed by the New York Times.
I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public.
A 1996 article in the same newspaper stated that the papers exposed the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson's administration had consistently lied to both the public and Congress.
Of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see and brought cries of outrage from Washington.
These papers disclosed that the U.S. had secretly expanded its actions in the Vietnam War through covert raids and attacks, actions not reported in mainstream media. Ellsberg faced charges of conspiracy, espionage, and theft of government property. Still, these were later dropped when it was revealed that the Nixon White House had engaged in illegal efforts to discredit him during the Watergate scandal.
Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy.
In June 2011, the Pentagon Papers were declassified and made public. The release of these classified documents provided a detailed account of the U.S. government's military involvement in Vietnam, leading to increased skepticism among the public about the government's actions and motives. The Camp David Accords were important agreements signed by the leaders of Egypt and Israel after almost 2 weeks of secret talks at Camp David, the U.S. president's country retreat. President Jimmy Carter played a key role in bringing Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin together for these negotiations, and the accords were officially signed on September 17, 1978. The purpose of these historic agreements was to improve the often strained relations between Israel and Egypt, although the lasting impact of the Camp David Accords is still a topic of debate. The main goal of the accords was to create a foundation for peace in the Middle East.
Most of the major issues are resolved already in this document.
This involved getting Arab nations to formally acknowledge Israel's right to exist, establishing a process for the withdrawal of Israeli forces and citizens from the occupied territories in the West Bank, which would pave the way for a Palestinian state, and taking measures to ensure Israel's security. Before the accords, Egypt and Israel had a history of military and diplomatic conflicts dating back to Israel's establishment in 1948. Tensions escalated after the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The situation was complicated by Israel's control of the Sinai Peninsula, which had previously been under Egyptian authority since 1967. Even though the Camp David Accords were a groundbreaking agreement between longtime adversaries, with both Sadat and Begin receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, the overall impact of the accords is still debated today. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the Middle East continues to grapple with ongoing conflicts. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Southern Democrat, emerged victorious in the United States presidential election, marking a significant moment in American political history. His election was viewed as a direct response to the corruption and scandal that marred the preceding Nixon era. The Watergate scandal, which led to President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, had eroded public trust in government officials and institutions. Carter's campaign emphasized a departure from political misconduct and a shift towards a more moralistic approach to governance. He presented himself as an outsider, a Washington outsider, untainted by the scandals that had rocked the nation.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
Carter's background as a peanut farmer and a former governor of Georgia appealed to many voters who sought a fresh and honest leader. The American public, fatigued by the turbulent events of the Watergate scandal, found solace in Carter's promise of a government that would prioritize honesty, integrity, and transparency. His commitment to moral values resonates with voters across the country, helping him secure a decisive victory in the Electoral College. Carter's presidency, which began in 1977, aimed at restoring faith in the government and fostering a sense of ethical responsibility in politics. His administration faced numerous challenges, both domestically and internationally. Still, the foundation for his election was built on a desire for a more principled and virtuous leadership, steering the nation away from the shadows of the recent past. As the curtain falls on Jimmy Carter's election, a question lingers. How did his presidency impact the delicate balance of global power? Let's unravel the diplomatic complexities. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks, or SALT, were important discussions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They happened in two parts, called SALT I and SALT II. The first talks started in Helsinki in November 1969, leading to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and a temporary agreement between the two nations. The second round concluded in Vienna in 1979, but the U.S. Senate didn't approve the treaty due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later that year. The Supreme Soviet in the USSR also didn't ratify it. As a result, the agreement ended on December 31, 1985, though both sides continued to follow its terms. These talks paved the way for the START agreements, which aimed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. START I, completed in 1991 between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and START II, a 1993 agreement with Russia, although it never took effect, set limits on multiple warhead capacities and other restrictions on nuclear weapons. The talks were vital in slowing down the nuclear arms race during the Cold War. They eventually led to New START, a successor to START I, which was ratified in February 2011. These diplomatic efforts played a crucial role in promoting international security and curbing the danger of nuclear weapons proliferation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Desegregation refers to the process of ending racial segregation, where people of different races are kept apart. In the United States, this was a significant issue, especially in the southern states, where laws and practices kept African Americans separate from white Americans. In the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement emerged to fight against racial discrimination and segregation.
And the whites in Alabama didn't have the power to tell me to get up because dare not sit while a white man is standing.
A crucial tactic in the push for desegregation was busing. It entailed transporting students to schools beyond their neighborhoods to encourage racial integration. However, this method sparked controversy and faced resistance from certain communities. However, it played a crucial role in breaking down racial barriers in schools, allowing students of different races to learn and grow together. Alongside desegregation efforts, there were advancements in civil rights protections. Civil rights refer to the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmark legislations that aimed to end racial discrimination in public places and ensure equal voting rights for all citizens.
Blacks in Montgomery continue to boycott the buses, week after week, month after month.
Furthermore, the extension of civil rights protections also addressed the rights of women and minorities. The women's liberation movement advocated for gender equality, leading to changes in laws and societal attitudes. Affirmative action policies were implemented to address historical disadvantages faced by minorities, promoting equal opportunities in education and employment.